Hey, everybody, this is Simon Rosenberg from NDN, and this is a new presentation that we're unveiling today, just a few weeks before the 2022 election. This is on the Hispanic vote, and some of you know that NDN has been at the forefront of helping explain the growing Hispanic electorate to the American people. We introduced bilingual polling to the Democratic Party 20 years ago. We pioneered and created the first Spanish language ads that were ever produced by a Democratic organization 20 years ago with Bob Menendez and Ken Salazar. And so we've been at the forefront of this conversation now for 2 decades. And we felt it was important for us to weigh in on the current discussion about what's happening with the Hispanic vote. Because I think and I'm going to get going here, as we say here, is that I think that the narrative, which has been almost entirely about democratic erosion, is woefully incomplete or even fundamentally wrong. And let me try to take you through and this is what this presentation is going to be about today. In the past 20 years, here are the top lines, right? In the past 20 years, Democrats have turned the heavily Mexican-American parts of the US far more blue. This has been probably the single most important geographic development in American politics over the last 2 decades. We'll get into that a little bit more in a bit. In 2020, despite the dip that happened with Hispanic voters on a national level, Democrats actually had their best year in the Southwest ever. It was the first time we won Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Nevada in 80 years. And we now control all 8 Senate seats in these 4 states, up from 3 20 years ago. And 2022 could be even better. And even with their gains with the national Hispanic vote, which is clear, I'm not disputing that, the Republicans are falling further and further behind in this region. And if they can't continue to improve their standing with Hispanic voters, this region will keep slipping away from them. This is what we're going to talk about today. So let's start with some basic math. And there's been a lot of bad math in the analysis of the Hispanic vote this cycle. And I'm going to try to explain to you why. And the most important thing to know is that the Hispanic electorate is growing very rapidly. And so you're not dealing with a static dealing with a static electorate. So let's just go through some basic math here, right? So 65% of 100 is 65. 63% of 200 is 126. As you probably see, 126 is a lot more than 65, right? It's a lot more. And there's no way, if you were looking at this data, that you would characterize this data as erosion, right? There's a lot of ways of discussing what we're seeing here, but the notion that the central thing that's happening in this set of data is the decline from 65 to 63, then characterizes it all as erosion, when in fact, what we're looking at is dramatic gains. And this is the fundamental math problem for most of the analysis of the Hispanic vote, is that it is not we can have a smaller share of the Hispanic vote and still gain more net votes than Republicans, right? And so this has been absent from the conversation, and let's go through some of this, right? This is a exploding part of the American electorate. The eligible share of voters who are Latino, Hispanic, has doubled in the last 20 years. And it's growing, 2 million or so every 2 years, 4 million every presidential cycle, 4 to 5 million. And we saw the biggest expansion of the Hispanic electorate that in recent times between 2016 and 2020. There was a huge explosion. And if Texas becomes a competitive state, it will put a lot more Hispanic voters in play. I mean, part of the issue with the Hispanic vote is that large chunks of the Hispanic community are not in competitive states like Illinois and New York and so on. And so the issue always was that, about turnout and registration, but this is just a hugely growing part of the electorate. And so going back to my math, right, the electorate has doubled. And so if Democrats even got just a little bit less than they got before, they would still be netting out far more votes. And let's just look at that dynamic here. And this is I'm using exit polls here, right? This is just to create an apples to apples comparison. The exit polls may have been a little bit pro-Democratic in 2020, but this is the exit polls. And the column on the far right shows you the net margin that Democrats got nationally from the Hispanic vote in each of these elections, right? In the presidential, I stuck just with the presidential elections for ease of use. And let's start with 2004 here, where Bush, did a very good job, and we're going to go through this in a minute. Bush took Clinton, got 72% in 96. Here you see Bush got it down to 62. He then dropped it down to 53. And our net margin with Hispanic voters in that election cycle was an estimated about 700,000. In 2020, using the exit polls, it was 5.5 million. This is almost 5 million more votes, right, than we got in 2004. There is no way to characterize this as erosion, right? These are gains. These are huge, significant, transformative gains for the Democratic Party. Biden's net margin in 2020 was 7 million votes. 5.5 million of that came from Hispanics, right? So this is a huge number that, of course, as you can see, if Democrats can maintain a decent margin here, continues to grow. That goes back to that math issue, right? Is that even a smaller share of a growing electorate nets out more net votes. The net votes is what matters, right? The share of something doesn't matter, right? What matters is how many more votes are you getting from the community? And the Hispanic community is doing its part to help Democrats win elections all across the country. This is a really dramatic thing. And this has, by the way, been totally absent from virtually any of the political analysis that you've seen on the Hispanic electorate this cycle. And so my point to all of you is a slightly smaller piece of a much bigger pie is still a lot more pie. And that's part of what's going on here. And so let's go through. So these increasing net margins that we've had, this dynamic that I'm explaining is also playing out in the states, right? In every state, you're seeing similar, oops, I saw a typo there. You're seeing a similar growth in margins in Arizona and Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, right? This dynamic is playing out, as I've discussed, where we're growing our net margins in every election. And let's go through the math. Let's go through the maps, the electoral college maps here, just to show you how significant this all is, right? So this is 96, it's a big Clinton win. Clinton wins in Arizona, Florida, New Mexico, Nevada, right? But he doesn't win Colorado here, notice, and of that, the Southwest, as we call it, I refer to the Southwest as Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Colorado, right? In this, for the purposes of this discussion, but he does win Florida, right? So strong performance here, re-election, he won by big margin. In 2000, Bush, advancing really the first national Hispanic strategy of the major political parties, the Hispanic electorate was starting to get big enough that was starting to really matter. The Bush family was from Texas and Florida. They understood these politics. They ran a very effective national campaign. And look what they did, right? They took back Nevada, Arizona, and Florida from the Democrats, right? And Bush barely won the election. These gains that he made in these heavily Hispanic states were one of the main reasons he won the election in 2000. In Florida, a state that he won or lost by 500, 600 votes, Bush outspent Gore 10-1 on Spanish. If that had been a 2-1 advantage, Al Gore would have been president. And so the success of the Republican strategy in 2000 was instrumental in creating the narrow election victory for George Bush. And I will tell you that that's when NDN started getting involved. And by 2002, in the spring of 2002, working with Sergio Bendixen and Bob Menendez and Ken Salazar, we developed a presentation that was similar to what I'm showing you now about how the Republican gains were beginning to really threaten our ability to win national elections. And that's when our Hispanic project began 20 years ago. We introduced bilingual polling with the firm Bendixen and Amandi. Fernando Amandi may be on today, in the spring of 2002 with Bob Menendez. And then in the fall of that year, we created the first Spanish language ads in Colorado with Ken Salazar. And our argument was Republicans are making gains. We have to do something about it. It's very similar to the discussion that we're having now. All of this work that we're going to go through was born in a time of duress, not in a time of success. And then in 2004, Bush now wins all 4 Southwestern states and wins Florida, right? And again, what was a narrow victory for him. Without having flipped these 4 states, he would not have been president in either 2000 or 2004. So the gains that he made with Hispanics, and as you saw, he dropped we went from 72 to 53, right? He made galloping gains with Hispanic voters. And this was really threatening our ability to be a national political party. This has been, by the way, you're looking at the most successful presidential campaign going all the way back to 1984 here. And their success was predicated on a modern strategy towards Hispanics that Democrats had to match. And in 2004, NDN ran ads in 5 of these states, in the 5 Hispanic states, Florida and the 4 Southwest. And in fact, we gained ground in many of these states from where we had been. It was a very effective campaign, but that was the first national campaign of the Hispanic community. And in this time, I was running around with a map showing that if we invested heavily in Florida, Nevada, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, and Texas, we could take away the Electoral College for the Republicans for a long time. So that's where the national Hispanic strategy of the Democratic Party was born in a time of duress and Republican gains. It's really important to recognize that. Bush in 2004 won all 5 of these states. The Republicans at this point controlled 14 of the 21 House seats in the Southwest, and they controlled 5 of the 8 Senate seats. So we were really struggling here, and we needed a new strategy, and NDN helped provide that. And look what's happened since, right? Let's go through this. In 2008, Obama wins back Colorado, Florida, New Mexico, and Nevada to help, fuel his victory. He gets his Hispanic number way up using many of the people that NDN worked with. I mean, we brought our Hispanic work into the Obama campaign in 2008, and I played a role in all of that. And then in 2012, I'm not going to go through each one for time reasons, right? So in 2008, this is sort of in 2012, we don't win Arizona, we win these states, and Obama gets way up to like 71% with the Hispanic, the best showing we ever had. But in 2020, I want to be very clear about what happened here. Even though we've lost Florida, Biden won these 4 Southwestern states for the first time that a Democrat won all 4 of those states in 80 years. We had not won those 4 states since the 1940 election. And so, yes, we've had erosion in Florida. There's no question about that. But despite the fact that there was a dip nationally, because of the net margins that I was talking about earlier, we have now done better in the Southwest in 2020 than in any year in 80 years. And today, we not only we won those 4 states, we control all 8 Senate seats there, up from 3 in 2004, and we control 14 out of the 23 House seats. And so just to go through this a little bit, just to show how significant this is, right, is that we've gained now 5 Senate seats in this region, including 4 in just the last 2 elections, despite the dip, right? And the gains that we made in the House, 7 pickups. Without those gains, Democrats would not control the House and the Senate. This is really significant. These were significant. We took a region of the country that 18 years ago was leaning Republican and is now a lean Democratic region. And if you look at the seats we've gained in the House in California, right, it's even more. We've sort of gotten almost everything we can out of California, and we're continuing to erode the Republican advantage in Texas. So part of the story here of the Hispanic vote in the Democratic Party is that the center of gravity of the Democratic Party is moving west. Right, Representative Lujan from New Mexico, I was an advisor to the DCCC in 2018, flipped the House, Cortez Masto flipped the Senate, the Speaker Pelosi and Leader Reid were from the West. And in what is really kind of a remarkable thing, Kamala Harris is the first Western Democrat to ever be west of the Mississippi to either be president or vice president of the United States, right? The West was a Republican area. And so this is a huge set of achievements. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Let's talk about what happened in 2020 and where we are now, right? This is sort of the overview, the historic overview. This is 3, and one of the things you'll notice here is there's a lot of competing data, and the data is kind of all over the place here, which makes some of the analysis of this really hard. And we'll talk a little bit more about the data challenges towards the end of the presentation. But so there's no question that in 2020, we had a dip. But what's important is that what you see in the Pew data and the exit poll data is that we actually gained in 2018 over 2016. And this is really important because it's not like there's been a long, slow erosion. Catalyst has slightly different data, but you can see that it's really more just the Republicans picking up a little bit. But it's my belief that we did not fall back in 2018. I was working with the DCCC. I know what we did. I know the money that we spent. And I more believe the Pew and the exit poll data for 2018. And it's important that we establish, because what it means is that the dip happened in 2020, and it was specific to 2020, and it wasn't something that was a slowly melting ice cube from previous elections. That's what I believe. But the data is inconclusive about that. But it's what I believe from having done this for 20 years. And despite this dip that you're seeing here, we still had our best year in the Southwest in 80 years. And that's the important thing to keep in mind. That's success. Those are gains. That's not erosion. The erosion narrative is an inaccurate way of describing what we're looking at here. And then this is 2022, right? This is the 4 polls that have been done in just recent weeks. We're not in, my view is that our goal now, with Florida having slipped away from us a little bit, is that we need to be shooting for sort of 65-35, about a plus 30. I just don't think we're going to be able to get up into the high 60s until we fix the Florida problem. And as you can see, the Washington Post poll, the most recent of these polls, have us within striking reach, within the ability to get to 30, right? And in 2020, you see here, so there's not been further erosion. There's no evidence of further erosion. It's that things changed in 2020. And my hope is that we actually improve upon our 2020 numbers and start to reclaim lost ground. But again, the lost ground geographically, we lost ground in Florida, but Republicans have lost a lot of ground in the Southwest. And that's really the complexity of what we're dealing with here. Let's look at what we're seeing this year in these elections in this region of the country, the expanded, what I call the heavily Mexican-American parts of the country. Mark Kelly's running above his 2020 numbers in statewide polling. Hobbs is running 15 to 18 points ahead of our gubernatorial candidate, 2018 gubernatorial candidate in Arizona. Newsom is running ahead of his 2018 numbers in most polls. Polis is way ahead of his 2018 numbers, and Bennett is ahead of 2016 in the averages. Lujan Grisham won't make her 2018 numbers, but she's still going to win by high single digits and is comfortably ahead in New Mexico. I'm going to get to questions at the end, and if I don't get to it, certainly email me. And in Nevada, Cortez Masto is running close. We won these elections by 2 points. We believe in our polling that she's up 2 to 3 points right now. I know that's not where the average is, but I was just out there last week. I met with the campaign. There is polling both on the campaign side and on the independent side showing very similar numbers. So we think we're within margin of error. We don't view this as behind, and we'll see what happens, right? She could end up losing, but certainly we're within the margin of error of where this race has been. So it's not erosion, and characterizing an erosion is outside of what the data suggests at this point. And then Abbott in Texas won by 21 and 14, 13 and 18. He's up 5 to 7 points now, right? And Beto is running ahead of 2018-2020 Dem results. So in 2022 and 2020, we had our best year in this region we've ever had. We're doing better than 2020 in this region today. And again, if there's erosion here, it's Republican erosion. It's not Democratic erosion. The status quo is not sufficient for them, because even at plus 28, plus 30 nationally, we keep gaining net votes out of this region. They have to make further gains to try to, cut into our significant advantages that we're developing here. And by the way, the evidence of what I'm talking about is how Arizona every 2 years continues to get better for us. Colorado continues to get better. Texas continues to get better. California continues to get better. This is consistent with the analysis that I've been doing in this presentation. And so what we have to remember here, if we take a step back, is the southwestern part of the US is the birthplace of the pre-Trump Republican Party, right? The conservative movement began in Arizona and California. The most significant Republican figures of the last 50 years outside of Trump have all come from this region of the country, right? It produced the only 2-term Republican presidents that we've seen since the 1950s. And so this was the engine of the modern Republican Party. And so these gains that we're making here really matter. This was not a lean Democrat region. This was not a blue part of America. This was the center of the Republican machine over the last 50, 60 years. And so historically, these are significant achievements, and we've taken away one of the most significant Republican regions of the country away from them in recent years. And it's arguably the single most significant geographic development in American politics over the last 20 to 25 years. Our Hispanic strategy in the Democratic Party has been an overwhelming success, and we need to view it that way. We have problems in Florida, but in these other big parts of the country, including the two biggest states in America today, we're doing really well, and we should be proud of the progress that we've made. So let me talk about what we're seeing in the Southwest here is that there has been very little Hispanic-only polling. What we're getting a lot this cycle is subsamples of larger polls that tend to not have Spanish interviews, that tend to be much older voters. And people, and just so you know, Spanish-speaking Hispanics are much more Democratic. Older Hispanics are much more Republican. So if you've got an English older Hispanic subsample, you're going to get a more Republican number. This is part of the problem of polling in the Hispanic community. In all the statewide polls that we have that have large samples that are bilingual, Democrats are outperforming their 2020 numbers. I want to be really clear about this. We'll see what happens on election day. But again, there's no evidence of continued erosion here, right? And that we have to reject the erosion label. And so I just want to make a note about the data, is that working with data in the Hispanic community is really hard. As you saw, there's a lot of competing data. It's also really hard to poll Hispanics. They're very young. They're not responsive to traditional methods of talking to people, right? There's also a large number of Spanish speakers. And if you don't have a fully bilingual phone bank, which by the way costs twice as much as an English only phone bank, then you're going to get far too many English speakers and your sample is going to be far too Republican. I'll give you an example of this. In the first national poll that the New York Times did a few months ago, they had Hispanics at +4 Democrat, right? When Nate Cohn even mentioned in his write-up that number seemed off. And then they did an Hispanic-only poll, and it was +24 Democrat, right? I just want you to understand that in the New York Times, Nate Cohn, gold standard, there was a 20-point differential between them polling Hispanics with a small subsample and then expanding to an Hispanic-only sample, right? So a lot of the data that we're getting with Hispanics, these 150, 125 subsamples, are total junk and should have to be dismissed as legitimate polls. If you're not looking at a fully bilingual 600-person sample, you're not really looking at a poll of Hispanics. And this is really, really important. And I think what's important is that we have to really start talking more about state-by-state numbers. This is a very diverse community. I mean, I was married in Santa Fe, New Mexico. My wife's from New Mexico. The people in northern New Mexico consider themselves to be Spanish, right? And they're not, because they've been there since the 16th century. These communities are very different. We have to honor their diversity and not try to lump them all into something called Hispanic or Latino. And so let's do some math here to close up the presentation. I want to come back to this math thing and this net margin thing. Assuming the exit polls were correct and they're, our net margin in 2020 was 5.4 million votes. Look at the various scenarios I have here. I won't walk through it, but this shows what happens in 2024 if, you see a net vote increase and Democrats get to 65, which is what I hope we get to. I don't know that we're going to be able to get above that with Florida being sort of moving more Republican. But we then gain, we're starting to gain another 1 million votes, another 1.5 million votes, right? If we get to 67 share and there's a big Hispanic turnout, we could gain 2 million votes. And look at how our net margin increases. This is a big problem for the Republican Party, right? This is why, even with the gains they've made, it's insufficient. They have to continue to break through and make gains. I don't think they're doing it this cycle. And we have to recognize the math here. This is an inexorable set of data, and it's very dangerous for the modern Republican Party. We could create a similar set of data, by the way, for Asian American voters, which will show that over time, the net margins are going to increase in states that have large numbers of AAPI voters. And so remember, right, a little bit less of a lot more is still a lot more. And Hispanics have done their part in the Democratic Party to have changed and transformed this region of the country and to contribute to our national success in where we've won more votes in 7 out of 8 national elections since 1992, when this electorate started really becoming meaningful. And they've obviously contributed significantly to our electoral college success, to our majorities in the House and Senate. And this notion that somehow Hispanics have kind of drifted from the Democratic Party or let us down I also reject that powerfully in this presentation today. And so my final comment here is my explanation for the dip, what's happened. We have to remember that if this was specific to 2020 and the hangover of 2020, and I think there is a hangover from COVID, that what happened is that there was a very big thing that happened in our politics in 2020 and 2021 and even 2022, which was COVID. COVID hit the Hispanic community much harder than it did the rest of the country. Hispanics have more uninsured people, people who have less access to the social safety net. In a pandemic, not having health insurance is kind of a big deal, right? They have less wealth, more jobs where they had to go to work every day. Hispanics died and got COVID at much higher rates than the rest of America. COVID was a big deal in this community. And I think the shutdown Democrat attacks that Trump made and Republicans have continued to make, it's the core of DeSantis's entire candidacy. It opened a door for Republicans who were struggling, for Hispanic men in particular, who had to make a living and who had shutdown to deal with and had to care, proudly for their family. It made it much more difficult. And I think a door was opened for Republicans during this shutdown argument. And I think we have to work on closing that door. We have to work on closing that door by refocusing on opportunity and upward mobility. And we have a lot to work with today to do that. Today, we have the lowest Hispanic unemployment rate that there's ever been. We have the lowest uninsured rate that we have ever had, and the Hispanic community has disproportionately benefited from that. Hispanic new business formation is at very elevated levels, and a lot of the infrastructure investment and the investment we're making are going to disproportionately affect jobs that Hispanics hold. We have a strong record to run on here, and we need to run on it aggressively in this election and coming years to get our numbers back up to where we want them to be, to put these parts of the country out of reach, to make Texas competitive. And then I had a slide about Florida, and I was just going to say, and we need a Florida project. I mean, Florida is a distinct place. I've done a lot of work there over the years. It is operating differently from this region of the country. We've got to acknowledge our struggle there. We've got to put a lot of resources and make investments there. We can't let it go. We got to reclaim it. It's lost ground. We won. Not only did we win statewide in 2012, we won the Hispanic vote in 2012. We even won the Cuban vote in 2012. I was part of that. I think we can reclaim some of that lost ground, but you can't shoot unless you score. We have to be much more aggressive in doing so in the coming years. I also just want to acknowledge the many people who've been partners with me in this work over a long period of time. Sergio Bendixen, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, was really the inspiration for all of this work. He is the godfather of the modern strategy for the Democratic Party and the Hispanic community. And I'm also very proud to have made enormous contributions in introducing bilingual polling, introducing Spanish language advertising. We conducted the first Hispanic Spanish language debate in 2007, along with Univision, first time ever. It was our strategy to add a southern state and a southwestern state to the early primary mix that birthed the creation of Nevada and South Carolina in the 2008 cycle. And so I'm very proud of this work. To me, this has probably been the most meaningful work in my political career. I'm deeply proud of it. I hope more Democrats and Hispanic operatives in particular are proud of what we've been able to do. We've done something really significant here, and we've had, some adversity, but, we just got to put our head down, keep working hard, and I think we can reclaim much of the lost ground that we've seen in recent years. Thank you so much, everybody. Let me open it up now to all the way that we take questions in this modern age. And again, almost all this data is available on my website. So there are two ways to jump into the conversation here. One is you can raise your hand, and Hans, I'm going to allow you to talk, pull you in here, Hans. Go shoot, brother.
Okay, can you hear me? I mean, okay. I know we get the margins matter here, and I take your overall big point about the pie and it increasing a smaller slice, but it's ultimately a bigger slice if you compare year to year. I want to dig down under the Nevada numbers because you had CCM at 63, I guess. And you said I think you said that was better than what she did in what Democrats did in 2020. Because I thought, and again, I don't know if we're looking at Catalyst, if we're looking at Equus, if we're looking at Pew, but I thought Democrats were in the high 60s in Nevada, in 2020.
So in 2016, when she won by about 30 points. And they believe right now that they're at a very similar place in the race. Scott Fairchild is running that race, used to work with me, we're colleagues. I was out there last week. I spent an entire afternoon in the campaign. And they believe they're up 2-3, and they believe the Hispanic numbers are holding. They've not seen any erosion with Hispanic.
But they think their Hispanic numbers are around the 63, around where you have them.
Yeah, they think they're up, in the low 30s. And again, there's a question of just how granular. I mean, I think what I just want to, my admonition to everybody here today is that we just can't push the data past what it's capable of doing from a math standpoint, right? There's a lot of conflicting data. And so I just think you have to work in ranges. And the point I'm making, Hans, right, is that if the states where we've seen growth in 2022, right, are Arizona, Colorado, California, and Texas. In Nevada, if we hold on, and my explanation for what happened in Nevada is that Nevada was probably hit by COVID economically more than almost any state in the country. I mean, the disruption of the tourist industry was brutal there. There was unbelievable economic disruption, probably, again, outside of any other state. The Democrats were in charge of the state, and there is a deep hangover. This explanation I have for what's happened is consistent with what I've seen on the ground, and frankly, in what we picked up in our own polling, which is that there is this sense that the shutdown Democrats, right, took away our livelihood for 6 months, 9 months. And so it means that we're not seeing growth there. We're just holding on to what we had. I mean, it's been
just getting back to the actual data. And again, I don't want it to work too hard.
Yeah.
The numbers that I have heard from Nevada is that Democrats need to do about 66% among Hispanics if they want to counteract.
That's 30. That's 30 points, right? That's 65.
Right. But you have her at 62 right now.
But that was prior to the primary, and so we had her up 38, and I'm sure that was prior to Laxalt actually winning the primary. So I'm sure he gained, right? I'm sure he gained 8 to 10 points after he won the primary. We're in that range right now.
So what I'm saying, should I use 62? Is 62 a fair number to use where you think, or is that dated? What was the date on that poll? I guess
I'll share it with Hans. I'll share it with you. We can go over it afterwards, but we had it. This stuff's all publicly available, by the way. It's on our website. You can go pull it up. And my own view, right, is having been out there and talked to them. And remember, I put the first Spanish language ad ever up on Las Vegas television back in 2003, right? So I mean, we created this modern strategy towards Hispanics. And so I was there at the creation of all this in Nevada and Las Vegas. And I worked very closely with Reed over all these years, right? And so I know the state. I've done a lot of work here. And we feel generally, and as Scott will tell you, if he doesn't talk to reporters that much, but what he'll told me is that, they've not only been doing polling, but they've been doing a lot of focus groups, and they feel really good about where they are right now, and that Laxalt is not selling well to this community and is not an easy fit for this community. And Laxalt isn't actually trying that hard either to win over these voters. There's some outside organizations starting to spend there, but he himself has not committed a lot of time and energy towards the Hispanic vote. And so they feel this whole notion that what happened was there was a single poll done by AARP. There hadn't been a lot of polling of Nevada. There was a period, there was sort of a dry period. And the one poll there was this AARP poll, which showed her at plus 11. If she was at plus 11 with Hispanics, she'd be losing by 10 points, right? It was just so farcical as a data point, given that the elections within margin of error where it was in 2020 and 2018, 2016, that means there just hasn't been a big shift with any of the demographic groups, right? There hasn't been any kind of profound shift. And one of the reasons I talked about math today, and I'm going to start talking about math a lot more, and I was a math kid and I took 3 semesters of college calculus and all this other stuff, is that, there is a lot of bad math in the political analysis this cycle, more than I've ever seen. And for people to publish a poll like AARP did, showing her up plus 11 and ahead in the race by 4 points, is just mathematically impossible. It's like literally impossible that could be true. And so we're just seeing a lot of really bad data, and we're seeing really, really bad data with Hispanics because of the problems that I raised earlier with language barriers and also youth, young people, and being able to reach them and get an accurate sample. I want everyone to recognize, and Hans, I know you know this, but an Hispanic subsample this is the way polling works, right? When you do an 800-person sample poll of a state, you need to get the demographics right across the entire poll. The subsample demographics don't have to be correct. So in an Hispanic subsample of 125 people in Nevada, that sample can be all people over 50 and 60% men and 40% women. It can be totally off from the actual statewide sample because they're trying to get the bigger sample correct, right? So what we're seeing is you just cannot trust any poll done of Hispanic voters that is not fully bilingual and with a minimum of 600-person sample. Otherwise, you're just going to a place where the margin of error and the possibility of error is very, very high.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Hans. Happy to follow up with you after.
All right, we'll do.
Okay. Okay, let me go to other questions. Hans is an old buddy of mine. Oh my God, we got a lot of questions. Hold on. Let me turn Hans off here just visually. There we go. Okay, let me go to the Q&A, and there are a lot of them, and there's some good people here asking tough questions. Robert asked the first question about the bifurcation of Hispanic men and women. Yeah, no, look, there's no question that that men have drifted, and whether or not this is because of Trump and his kind of machismo, whether this is because of the economic explanation that I gave, I think this is something that's real, and it will be interesting to see what happens because of abortion, right? What's interesting is that Hispanics are very pro-choice. This idea that Hispanics are moving to the Republican Party because of social conservatism is something Republicans have been arguing for 20 years, even when we were getting 72% of the Hispanic vote. So it is, to use a colloquial phrase, bullshit, right? And Hispanic voters are overwhelmingly pro-choice, including men, by the way, and women more so, but men too. And also remember that if you're a 24-year-old Latina living in Texas, I mean, your life has been transformed by the abortion restrictions. And so I think this is going to be, over time, a very big problem for Republicans in a community that is, disproportionate, has much higher percentage of people in childbearing years than the overall population. And so this is an issue to be heavily explored. The Economist this week, by the way, has a whole story about the issue of abortion and Hispanics and how it's playing to Democrats' favor. I mean, and so this was another one of these absurd myths that have been promulgated by, desperate Republicans, frankly, over the last couple of years. The issue of local law enforcement, Hispanics volunteer for the military at very high rates. They participate in local law enforcement. When you look at all measures of patriotism, this is the most patriotic group in the country in many instances. And so I don't think that's as big an issue. It's more of an issue on the border, but I also think that the bigger issue is the economic issue. That there was the economic hit to Hispanics during COVID was extraordinary. It was a life-altering event for many people, and we just cannot discount the impact of COVID on all of this. Can we, as COVID fades, and can we restore our standing with Hispanics and Hispanic men in particular? We can, but we can't if we don't make the arguments that I've been talking about today. And we have to be far more focused on economic opportunity and upward mobility and being able to feed your family and have a better life than we've been. And I think this is a big problem for Democrats writ large. I mean, Biden has been underperforming on economic issues from the beginning of his candidacy. This is a structural problem. I talk about this a lot in another presentation I do called With Democrats, which I'm doing on Friday. This is a big structural problem over us writ large, but where it's manifested significantly is in the Hispanic community, in my view. Danny, who's one of the leading experts, Danny Sepulveda, one of the leading experts in the country on this, writes that it's important to recognize also the Latino-heavy states, Florida, Texas, Arizona, have some of the most restrictive voter registration, voter access laws, and have the highest instances of voter intimidation. The rates at which Latinos are coming out in spite of the growing obstacles speaks to a hunger to participate and responsibility for us to fight for their right to vote. Let me give you a story about that. In one of the cycles, and I think it was 2006, and I'm forgetting, we made a decision to, when after 2000, if you remember, in the fiasco of what happened in Florida, many states loosened their voting laws to make it much easier. They added early voting, they added vote by mail, they sort of made it easier for people to participate. It was a bipartisan effort, by the way, it's hard to believe now. But in what we found in our research was that, you know, a lot of Hispanics had problems voting on election day because of their work, and they couldn't get the day off, and, you know, they were janitors or they were whatever, right? And that, you know, and it meant that they were often not believing they could vote because they didn't believe they could physically vote. So therefore they weren't going through the process of actually thinking through and voting and checking out candidates. They were just disengaged. We found in our research that if we educated Hispanic voters, and this was in Nevada in particular, this particular research we did, that if we told people you could early vote, and the government had made it possible for you to vote early so you could go on a day when you were not working and didn't have to take a day off, this was a big deal, right? To Danny's point, right? This was an invitation by the government, recognizing the struggles of people and having to feed their families, that we want to make it easier for you to vote. And as many of you know, that, you know, we're one of the only countries in the world that has voter registration. Many of these immigrants who've come from other places, the issue of registering to vote is not even an issue, right? I mean, you can just go vote on election day. And so this idea that there were these barriers was also a cultural barrier. And, you know, that was even more, I came to America, this amazing country, and they put up all these barriers for me participating. I don't have these barriers in my own country. And so we ran a series of ads that we focus grouped and tested and then put on the air throughout the Southwest, educating Hispanic voters in Spanish about early voting, vote by, and at that point it was more early voting than vote by mail. And we know it had a major impact. And so Danny's right that, you know, particularly in Texas, I mean, people don't realize this, but registering voters to vote in Texas is unbelievably difficult. The restrictions on the ability for you to be a person, you know, to go out and register people, you have to live in the county. It's just crazy stuff, right? And so we need to, I think, Danny, this is part of the next strategy, right? Because remember, we're talking about an infusion of new Hispanic voters every 2 years across all these states, right? We have to earn their support every 2 years. We have to be always on, being aggressive, fighting for the vote of a community that's young, that doesn't have deep connections with the Democratic Party. They don't know the history of the Democrats, right? We have to earn this vote every 2 years because there's so many new, new voters coming in every 2 years. And so Danny's right that we've got work to do here to make it clear that you know, we're the party that wants everybody to vote, right? I think that in general, this is something that really matters to people that have a, you know, struggle. But yes, all these early voting, vote by mail stuff really, really matters for Hispanic voters. We know this. I mean, this is a known thing, Danny, and it's something we have to continue to promote. Okay, I'm going on too long. Why doesn't Beto do a debate in Spanish? I don't know that Beto's fully Spanish speaking. I know he speaks some Spanish. I don't know that he's fluent. And also Abbott would never agree to it, right, Robert? I mean, that's the obvious thing. But he's producing an enormous amount of Spanish content, which is really important. And Democrats have to get far better in these parts of the country in producing organic Spanish content the way that Beto is. I mean, go check out Beto's Twitter feed. They're producing, you know, Spanish language videos, you know, every few days, organic content. Organic content matters. These are young people. They have phones. They live on their phones. You know, stuff gets, you know, sent to them through their social networks. We need to be creating more organic content in general, geared towards young Hispanics in both Spanish and English. We are not, as a matter of course, the Democratic Party is not producing enough organic content. I mean, this is a problem for with so many young voters in our family. It's too much TV. It's too much advertising that is not something that you can amplify and send through your networks. This is a bigger problem, and it's particularly acute with Hispanics. I think that in general, let me just go down and see. You're going to get, you know, you can reach me by DMing me on Twitter, and you can reach me on DMing me on Twitter, or also when you get the email thanking you for being part of this presentation, there'll be an email there that you can email me on. Let me just see, Molly Ball. what's becoming the immigration issue, which has been historically seen as crucial? Are Democrats paying a price for failing to keep their promises, or the mess on the border? Molly, it's a really great question, and I appreciate you actually raising that, because this is one of those things that needs to be aired out, and I appreciate you being with us today. Let me give you my best sort of counsel on how to think about that issue, and this is from 20 years of polling and work. I've also been an immigration advocate and worked a lot in the Obama administration to advance sensible, when there was a possibility of working with Republicans on these matters. I don't think we've been penalized for this. I think that, historically, there is, the immigration issue is usually, if you ask Hispanics what their most important issues are, it's jobs, healthcare, education. And as Sergio Bendixen used to say, that when you're an immigrant family, what was the phrase he used? Family values was about having a good job, having healthcare, and having a good education for your kids, and that all these other social issues were secondary to these core bread and butter issues. I think that's still the case in a community that has very little net worth, that is still socioeconomically in the early stages, right? And that immigration was always secondary. It wasn't unimportant, and it was a signal, right? It was a cultural signal that, did you care about people like me? But it was secondary, and it's still secondary, right? As it should be. I mean, to be honest, these are all people who have immigrated, or they've been here. In some cases, their families have been here for many generations, and so I don't think that I think the explanation that Democrats, Biden, if you're being fair-minded, right? I mean, Biden has been not, actually very welcoming to many people, right? And yes, he's shut down. I don't think there's a constituency for open borders in America. There's no constituency for that. What there is that people just want the immigration system, the border system, to work. And I think that the flow that we're seeing, I could talk about this for a very long time. It's going to shut down. And Molly, if you want to talk offline, is that my view about the immigration issue is that for Democratic voters and people that are going to vote for us this election, it's a very secondary issue. It's not seen as a major issue. It's seen as a major issue for Republicans for all the obvious reasons. It is a major issue, a voting issue for Republicans. It's not a major voting issue for us. We've got other concerns: COVID, healthcare, the economy, right? Democracy, all these things. But the issue of the border is, I think, going to be a really major governing issue for the country, particularly if Republicans win one of the two chambers. Because Biden hasn't screwed up the border. Biden hasn't made mistakes. Biden didn't invite all these people here. I mean, all these arguments that Republicans are making are absurd. What's happened is that there's a global migration crisis happening here and all around the world. And, that because of climate change, because of political instability, I mean, we saw last month an unprecedented thing happen on the border, which is the majority of people who came were not from the Northern Triangle, the traditional Northern Triangle countries in Mexico. They were from Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, fleeing, failed communist regimes who look and feel much more like traditional people who apply for asylum, political asylum, right? These weren't people who were economic migrants, who were asking for asylum. These were people who were fleeing failed communist regimes, which was one of the reasons the entire asylum system was created in the first place. And so we're into a very different place now, where because of changes that were made to American law, that were bipartisan, by the way, though, I mean, not changes, but because of the American legal system, we allow people who are under 18 who come to a port of entry to be given their day in court because of child sex trafficking issues that George Bush actually put into law in 2008. And the asylum system now is being expanded and defined into something beyond what it was meant to be. And so what's happening is that there's an enormous flow to the border, not because of Joe Biden, but because of our laws and them being exploited by cartels and other nefarious figures, and because of the instability of the world and COVID and climate change and political instability. So we have this, what's happening at the border is unprecedented. We've never had 1 million people show up and claim that they had some right to be in the country, which is something that they do based on our laws. And so we've got a lot of work to do here. And I think that Democrats need to lead here more aggressively. I think we've kind of ducked a little bit on the immigration issue in recent years. This is much more than about dreamers. This is about rule of law and about a condition where we could be in a place for a very long time where people from all over the world, I mean, what's going to be interesting to see is, are we going to start seeing Russians showing up? You know, are they going to fly into Mexico City and trudge up to the border to El Paso? Or are we going to start seeing Ukrainians, right? What happens when the people of the world in countries that are failing have enough money to jump on a plane, go to Mexico City and come up to the border? Well, our immigration system never contemplated anything like that. And so, you know, we've got a lot of work to do here. And I think the Democrats and the Biden administration need to do a better job explaining all of this to the public and not letting the Republicans really define us as they have. Because for Republican voters, this is a basic like competency issue, right? You guys suck, you can't get the work done, you got to get it done. And I think that Biden's done a good job on this, in my view, but we've got work to do here. Let me go. Thanks, Molly. Good to connect again. It's been a long time. Any other questions, anybody? An interesting question, which is, what do you want us to do with this work? Well, I want you to promote this video, and I want you to learn the data in here, and I want you to help make these arguments. I think that we have to, you know, basically the Republicans have been windmill dunking on the Democrats on this Hispanic erosion issue. And I've been trying to fight it since May when I wrote my first piece kind of rejecting it, but I haven't been terribly successful, to be honest. I mean, I've been very successful at helping change the narrative about the national election, about it being a competitive election, not a wave election, which I think now is the conventional wisdom. We've got work to do here to sort of create a more realistic picture of what's happening here. And I think that Democrats and my brethren in the Hispanic community need to stop feeling like they've screwed up here and they've made a mistake. I mean, they're part of one of the most, arguably the Democratic Party's most successful big picture strategy play of the last 25 years. I mean, we should be celebrating our successes. I mean, Colorado in 2004 was not even a battleground state for John Kerry. I mean, NDN was the only national organization that spent millions of dollars in that state. The Kerry campaign didn't even target it. It's now not even a competitive battleground state anymore. I mean, Jared Polis may win the governorship in Colorado by 20 points in this election. It's not even clear the Republican Party is going to be competitive in the way that they are in California. So the gains, I mean, I just want people to understand that as somebody who's been part of this for 20 years, Arizona was always the state that we knew was going to be the hardest to unlock. I mean, Texas comes next, but in the sequencing, right? California went first, and then kind of New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada's kind of stayed in this very competitive place, right? But based on the math that I went through with all of you, Arizona was always the, you know, McCain and Flake, the Republican Party was so strong there. What could we do there? And does everybody realize that we flipped both Senate seats in the last two elections there, right? We lost the governor's race by 15 points last time, and we're either even or ahead in that race, right? Again, and Mark Kelly is polling up 6-7 points, which is the best polling of a Democratic Senate candidate in Arizona, probably, you know, in decades, right? So we're doing better. The gains we've made in Arizona in recent years are extraordinary. And we should be aware that, like, now you're starting to see Arizona tip. And what happens in these states when this stuff starts happening, right, is that it creates this, it's a tipping point. It's happened in New Mexico, it happened in California, it's happening in Colorado. Arizona is moving more into the Democratic camp more rapidly than I would have anticipated. And I think part of what happened there was that the craziness of the Republican Party, the MAGA, was in everybody's face for the last 2 years because of all the election. They contested, all the people like Lake and everybody contesting the election. It was a daily drumbeat of Republican insanity. And I think it's just made it harder and harder for reasonable people to be with them. And so I'm really proud. And in Texas, right, Biden only lost by 5 points in Texas in 2020 without competing. Beto's within 5 or 6 points. Abbott won by 13, 21. Republicans were winning for decades, races there by 15, 20, 25 points all the time. Now, you know, Beto got within 2.5 in 2018. That wouldn't have happened without the margins we're getting from Hispanic voters. And so this whole idea also that in Texas, there's some kind of breach or anything else. I mean, look, Texas Hispanics have been the most Republican Hispanic electorate in the country has always been Florida. The second was Texas. And then the rest of the country was more Democratic. What I showed you earlier is that Beto is doing better than Biden did with Hispanics. Beto's doing better than our gubernatorial candidate did in 2018. Where, you're starting to see Texas, those margins that I described, start to become material in Texas. Danny's right, though. We have to accelerate that process. We need more money, more investment in Texas to accelerate and make it, possible for young Hispanic Democrats. And I do think the abortion restrictions there, which are the most significant in the country, is going to be a deal breaker for many childbearing age Latinos, potentially with the Republican Party in Texas forever. Because now there's a possibility, if you're a 24-year-old Latina, that you could die on a table in a hospital because people don't treat you. I mean, your life is now fundamentally different than it was a few months ago. And so I'm optimistic that in Texas, we've got a real opening here. But you can't score unless you shoot. The National Party hasn't invested enough here. We all should be very grateful to Beto for having continued to invest the kind of money and passion that he has. This guy's an extraordinary guy. I love Beto O'Rourke. I mean, he's running an exemplary campaign. He's teaching all of us how to run modern campaigns using modern media. And we all have to learn from him. And if his legacy is he got Texas close, because what happened in states like, and I'm going on too long, but I'll end with this, but in Virginia and in Georgia, these states, in Arizona, these states that tipped over, right? There was always a set of politicians like Mark Warner, Tim Kaine in Virginia. We've seen it in Georgia with Stacey Abrams, who were the bridges, who brought people who may have been available to Democrats because they were discontented with Republicans, but they brought them over and they created the shift. Because there's only, by the way, been 6 states since 2004 that have flipped from Republican to Democrat. And it's Georgia and Virginia, and it's the 4 Southwestern states. And so what we now have is that Beto is that transitional figure, but he's going to need 2 or 3 more people like him to help, realize the potential of the Democratic vote in Texas. He can't do it by himself. And that's where these years and years of being out of power, where it retards the ability of us to grow a farm team in states like Florida and Texas. This is where this stuff really matters, right? Where we just don't have the 5, 6, 7, 8 politicians you need to sort of push this whole thing over, as we've seen in Arizona, we've seen in other states. And Beto needs help. I mean, and it may be that this is a 10-year project and not a 5-year project, but yes, there should be much more national money going into Texas than there is. We have a real opportunity there. Let me end with that. Thanks everybody so much. If you have any questions following up on this, DM me. If you have any suggestions, DM me and use the email that you're going to get to email me. Thanks for being here, everybody. And be loud and proud about the work that we've done. This is an amazing success story for the Democratic Party, and we should be celebrating it far more than we have been. Thank you.